The dining room felt suffocating that morning, thick with the weight of unspoken expectations and the scent of roasted turkey. But none of us dared to acknowledge what was really happening. The autumn centerpiece sat perfectly arranged on our family's mahogany table, the same expensive decorations Mom had used for years to impress our relatives. The fireplace crackled with a warmth that never quite reached my corner of the room, and I could hear the distant chatter of cousins and aunts gathering in the kitchen. Everything looked picture-perfect, carefully orchestrated for maximum social impact, yet beneath the surface there was a tension that had nothing to do with holiday stress. It was the kind of tension that came from knowing with crushing certainty that I was about to watch my family celebrate everything I would never be. My mom, Vivian, stood there in her designer blazer, practically glowing with pride that made my chest tight with familiar dread. She had that radiant, self-satisfied expression she reserved for only one person in this house, Blake. She gestured toward the stack of papers in front of him, her manicured fingers trembling with excitement as she announced his latest triumph to the gathered family. I watched as my brother Blake straightened his tie, that practiced smile spreading across his face like he was accepting an award. His voice already taking on that rehearsed humility he used whenever he wanted to seem modest. He always did that, performed every achievement like we were living in some corporate success story and the cameras were rolling. And then he spoke. 300,000 this year, his voice was a mixture of pride and feigned modesty. Plus the bonus for closing the Henderson deal. Blake's eyes sparkled as he held up the bonus check, the numbers clearly visible to everyone at the table. And in a way, it was like he was holding the keys to everything our parents had ever wanted, because that money didn't just represent his success. It represented their validation, their proof that they had raised the perfect son. "We're so proud," my dad Theodore's voice was full of fatherly satisfaction that made my stomach churn. "Investment banking, Harvard MBA, everything we dreamed of." My throat constricted. Mom nodded with tears in her eyes, her face set like she was witnessing some kind of miracle. Blake let out a confident laugh, embracing both of them while our relatives applauded, his voice a confident chorus of, "Thanks, I've worked really hard for this," like a recording designed to impress. And me? I just sat there. My own announcement rested in my hands, a simple certificate, unimpressive, barely acknowledged despite the years of night classes and studying. Dad had glanced at it when I mentioned my CPA certification, an afterthought. No applause, no excitement, just a distracted, "That's nice, Harper." I could feel my heartbeat in my temples as I held the paper that represented 3 years of sacrifice, working full-time while studying for the most difficult exam in accounting. I didn't even try to interrupt their celebration. I just sat there staring at my certification, already knowing what it meant, already knowing what it said about my worth in this family. Because this wasn't just a Thanksgiving dinner. It was a performance, a tradition where Blake got standing ovations and I got polite nods, a tradition where my achievements were always footnotes to his headlines. And as I finally folded the certificate back into its envelope, I felt that familiar weight crushing down on my chest, the same weight that had been suffocating me my entire life. But what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that this year would be different. This year, I had discovered something that would change everything. I sat there staring at my CPA certificate, my fingers tightening around its edges as the weight of their indifference crashed down on me like a wave. The dining room still buzzed with Blake's triumph, his voice carrying that confident tone he used in board meetings, his manicured hands gesturing as he described his latest Wall Street victory. 300,000, plus bonuses, he kept repeating, his voice filled with that practiced humility. The same way he had performed every achievement since we were kids, as if our family dinners were just another networking event where he was the keynote speaker. Mom dabbed at her eyes, beaming with maternal pride while Dad stood beside her, nodding with the gravity of a man whose son had just cured cancer. "He's worked so hard for this," Mom said, her voice thick with admiration. And that was the moment something inside me cracked so violently it left me breathless. I swallowed hard, fingers tracing the embossed seal on my certificate as I stared at the 3 years of night classes and weekend study sessions reduced to, "That's nice, Harper." I knew even before this dinner that my achievements would be footnotes, background noise to Blake's symphony of success. It didn't matter because this wasn't about recognition. This wasn't even about Blake. It was about what it had always been about, whose dreams mattered and whose didn't. The memories flooded back before I could stop them, old wounds tearing open like they had been waiting for this exact moment. My college graduation, summa cum laude, where I had scanned the auditorium hoping to see familiar faces, but my parents had missed it for Blake's MBA networking dinner. They sent a text, "Congrats. Proud of you." But when Blake made partner track 6 months later, they flew to New York and threw him a celebration dinner at the Four Seasons. The night I passed my CPA exam on the first try, something only 30% of candidates achieve, I called home with shaking hands and racing heart. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom had said, distracted. "Blake just closed a $50 million deal. Can I call you back?" She never did. But when Blake got quoted in the Wall Street Journal, she called every relative we had, forwarding the article like it was breaking news. The day I received my first promotion to senior accountant, I drove to their house with a bottle of champagne, thinking maybe this time would be different. Dad barely looked up from his medical journals. "Numbers, huh? Well, someone has to do the paperwork," he muttered, his tone suggesting I had chosen to become a filing clerk. But when Blake moved to his corner office, they drove to Manhattan just to see his view of Central Park. I used to tell myself I was being too sensitive, that maybe I was imagining the favoritism. But moments like this, Blake's bonus check waved like a trophy, my certificate dismissed like a participation ribbon, confirmed what I had always known. This was real, and it had always been real. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving to Dad's medical practice, not because I wanted to, but because Mom had called with that familiar guilt-laden urgency. "Your dad needs help with his tax preparation. You know how busy he is saving lives. It would be nice if his accountant daughter actually helped once in a while." She didn't ask about my clients, my workload, my own deadlines. She didn't care. The only thing that mattered was that I played my role, the reliable numbers person who handled the boring details while Blake conquered Wall Street. The practice looked the same, sterile and impressive, designed to showcase Dad's success as a renowned cardiologist. Awards lined the walls, medical degrees displayed like trophies, everything carefully curated to project authority and wealth. Blake wasn't there, naturally. He was busy with important client meetings. The task seemed routine at first. I organized receipts while Dad grumbled about tax season, complaining how the government penalized successful people like him. I sat through his monologue about Blake's latest investment strategies, how proud he was that his son understood real money, not just a bean counting. They spent 20 minutes discussing Blake's new penthouse, the same reverent tone they used when talking about his Harvard degree. They never once asked about my work, my clients, or whether I enjoyed helping people navigate the tax code. By evening, I was exhausted from pretending their dismissal didn't hurt. I stayed late to finish organizing the medical practice's books, the familiar comfort of numbers and ledgers soothing my bruised ego. That's when I noticed something odd, the filing cabinet drawer labeled personal, slightly ajar. Dad was obsessively organized, everything locked and labeled with military precision. He never left anything unsecured. Something felt wrong. I stepped closer to his private office, the smell of leather and disinfectant heavy in the air. The cabinet was definitely open, files slightly askew. My heart pounded as I approached. I knew I should close it and walk away. I knew I should respect his privacy. But I didn't. My fingers pulled the drawer open wider, revealing meticulously organized tax documents dating back years. Inside were folders labeled with our family names, detailed financial records I had never seen before. And then, tucked beneath a stack of investment statements, I found something that made my blood freeze: tax returns filed under my name, returns I had never prepared or signed. My hands shook as I pulled out the documents, my breath catching in my throat. I shouldn't have looked deeper, but I couldn't stop. Inside were detailed records of income one had never earned, deductions I had never claimed, refunds I had never received. Someone had been filing fraudulent tax returns using my identity for years. I flipped through page after page, my hands trembling, scanning signatures that looked like mine but felt wrong. The deeper I dug, the worse it became. There were offshore accounts tied to my social security number, investments I had never made, tax shelters I knew nothing about. And then I found the smoking gun, a forged CPA stamp with my license number. Someone had been using my professional credentials to legitimize their tax fraud. My stomach dropped as the full scope hit me. This wasn't just family favoritism. This was federal tax evasion using my identity as cover. And for the first time in my life, I held all the cards. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the sterile glow of my apartment, the tax documents spread across my dining table like evidence in a federal case. My mind raced through every conversation, every dismissive comment, every moment they had treated my accounting career like glorified bookkeeping. How long had this been happening? Why had they chosen me? And more importantly, how had they been so confident I would never find out? I flipped back to the fraudulent returns, running my finger over my forged signature at the bottom of each page. The tax shelters were real. The offshore accounts existed. And according to these records, I had been unknowingly earning phantom income for nearly 7 years while they treated my actual career achievements like participation trophies. My stomach twisted with a sick kind of irony. It didn't make sense at first. If they were so obsessed with Blake's Wall Street success, if they had spent our entire lives celebrating his every promotion, why was my name on these illegal schemes? Why had they spent years dismissing my profession while secretly exploiting my CPA credentials? I sifted through more documents, fraudulent business deductions, fake charitable contributions, even phantom consulting fees paid to shell companies, all filed under my license number. Some of the schemes dated back to when I was still in college. And then I saw it, my professional seal, expertly forged on dozens of tax documents I had never prepared. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. Someone had been using my CPA credentials to legitimize their tax fraud. Someone had been banking on my reputation for integrity while stealing my professional identity. And based on the sophistication, it wasn't amateur work. I sat there staring at the evidence, my pulse hammering in my temples, the betrayal cutting deeper than any childhood slight. I had spent years believing I was overlooked, believing they saw my career as mundane compared to Blake's flashy success. But this wasn't neglect. This was calculated exploitation. And suddenly their dynamic made perfect sense. Blake was their trophy, their public success story, the son they could brag about at country club dinners. But I was something far more valuable. I wasn't just invisible. I was credible. I had always been the reliable one, the one who followed rules, the one who built a spotless professional reputation. I was the perfect cover, the clean identity they could hide behind when they needed legitimacy. And they had gambled everything on my continued ignorance. I pressed my palms against the table, forcing myself to think like the forensic accountant I had trained to be. The scope was staggering, but the evidence was ironclad. For years, I had been their unwitting accomplice in federal tax evasion, my name and credentials laundering millions of dollars. But that was about to change. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't just Harper the overlooked daughter. I was Harper the CPA with enough evidence to destroy them all. And I was going to use every bit of it. The next morning, I left Dad's practice before anyone arrived. Mom barely acknowledged my departure text, responding with a distracted, "Thanks for helping with the boring stuff." Dad never suspected that just hours earlier I had been photographing every piece of evidence in his private files, building an airtight case that would demolish their carefully constructed financial empire. I drove to my office in focused silence, my mind already calculating tax penalties, interest charges, and potential prison sentences. I didn't need to scream at them and demand recognition. That wasn't how you won a war against people who thought they were untouchable. If they had spent years treating me like an insignificant bookkeeper, then that was exactly what I was going to let them keep believing. I spent the next 3 months methodically preparing. First, I contacted Maxine, my colleague at the accounting firm, someone who specialized in tax fraud investigations and wouldn't blink when I laid out the scope of my family's crimes. We analyzed everything, every forged document, every phantom transaction, every fraudulent deduction that had been filed under my stolen credentials. The deeper we investigated, the more damning it became. And then we discovered the crown jewel, Dad's medical practice, the prestigious cardiology clinic he had built his reputation on. There was a massive problem. The practice was hemorrhaging money, not from malpractice suits or declining patients, but from Blake's investment advice. 2 years ago, Dad had liquidated the practice's malpractice insurance fund, redirecting the money into Blake's guaranteed return cryptocurrency ventures. The investments had crashed spectacularly. And rather than admit their golden boy had cost them everything, my parents had quietly begun using my identity to create fake tax shelters, desperately trying to hide their losses from the medical board. But they were out of time. The IRS was already conducting random audits on high-income medical practices, and Dad's name was on the list. And that was when I made my calculated move. I didn't warn them. I didn't give them a chance to cover their tracks. I simply walked into the IRS field office with 3 boxes of evidence and a formal complaint of identity theft and tax fraud. It took 2 weeks to process, another month for the investigation to begin. But when the federal agents knocked on Dad's office door, the satisfaction that coursed through me was better than any family dinner applause. Because I hadn't just exposed their fraud. I had used their own greed to destroy them. And they still had no idea it was me. I played my part perfectly. When Mom called panicking about some IRS misunderstanding, I made sympathetic noises. When Dad forwarded me articles about aggressive government overreach, I responded with concern. When Blake sent frantic texts about his parents' minor tax issues, I offered to help however I could. And I waited for the perfect moment, Thanksgiving dinner. Because if they had spent my entire life using family gatherings to remind me of my place, then it was only fitting that I used one to show them theirs. Thanksgiving dinner arrived 1 year later, and with it, the same rehearsed performance. Blake received congratulations on his latest promotion. Mom gushed over her brilliant son. Dad beamed with that look of paternal pride he reserved only for him. And then it was my turn. I handed Dad a small, unremarkable manila envelope, no fanfare, no decorations, just clean edges and the weight of something far more devastating than they could ever imagine. He chuckled, tapping it against the table, throwing Blake a confident smirk. "What's this, Harper? Finally decided to prepare my taxes for free?" I smiled. "Just open it." He did. Inside was a single document, official letterhead stark against crisp white paper, with federal seals pressed neatly across the top. His smile died instantly as his eyes scanned the first line, his face shifting from amusement to confusion, then comprehension, then pure terror. His breath caught. His hands began to shake. His mouth moved soundlessly. Mom leaned over his shoulder, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to dawning horror. But as her gaze landed on the document's bold header, her wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. Blake, still oblivious, looked up from his phone. "What's going on?" I watched the realization destroy them in real time. And then I said the words I had been rehearsing for months: "The IRS has frozen all your assets." Silence. I leaned back in my chair, my smile serene. "Happy Thanksgiving." The silence that followed was so complete, so suffocating, that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Dad sat paralyzed, gripping the federal notice so tightly the paper began to crease. Mom remained frozen over his shoulder, her face drained of all color as she stared at the document that detailed years of tax fraud. Blake, finally sensing the gravity, set down his phone and leaned forward. "Wait. What do you mean frozen assets?" He looked between them, waiting for explanation, waiting for reassurance, waiting for someone to tell him this was a mistake. But no one spoke. No one moved. And then, finally, Dad's voice cracked as he whispered, "This can't be happening." He flipped through the attached pages as if hoping the charges would disappear, as if the evidence would somehow evaporate. "The medical practice, the house, everything, this is impossible." I tilted my head slightly, watching him crumble. "Actually, it's very possible when you've been committing federal tax fraud for 7 years. My voice was calm, professional. I had practiced this moment countless times, imagining their faces when they realized their perfect daughter had been their downfall. Mom let out a sharp, broken breath. You reported us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded slowly. "Identity theft. Tax evasion. Fraudulent use of professional credentials." The IRS was very interested in my evidence. Dad's face went from pale to gray. "Evidence? What evidence?" I smiled, the same patient smile I used with difficult clients. "Your private files. Every forged signature. Every phantom deduction. Every time you used my CPA license to legitimize your schemes. Blake's voice cut through the tension, sharp with panic. Schemes? Dad, what is she talking about? Mom turned to me, her face contorting with desperation. Harper, sweetheart, there's been a misunderstanding. We can fix this. We can explain everything. I raised an eyebrow. Explain what? How you've been stealing my professional identity. How you've been filing fraudulent returns under my name. Her mouth opened, then closed. And there it was, that moment of recognition, that flicker of understanding in her eyes. Because deep down, they all knew exactly what they had done. They just never thought I was smart enough to figure it out. Why would you do this? Dad asked, his voice strained with betrayal. Why would you destroy your own family? Something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. My family? I repeated, my voice deadly quiet. You mean the family that used my name to commit federal crimes? The family that dismissed my career while stealing my credentials? He flinched, but I wasn't finished. You spent years treating me like I was worthless, like my accounting degree was some consolation prize. Every time Blake succeeded, you celebrated. Every time I succeeded, you acted like I had just learned to tie my shoes. I leaned back, my voice ice cold now. But I wasn't worthless. I was useful. And you gambled everything on me staying ignorant. Blake's voice cracked with disbelief. This isn't real. Dad, tell her this isn't real. I cut him off before Dad could answer. Your cryptocurrency investments lost everything. Our parents have been using my identity to hide the losses. And now the federal government knows. Blake made a strangled sound, turning to our parents. Mom? Dad? Fix this. You can fix this, right? But they were silent. And I saw it in their eyes then, the same realization that had been building for months. They hadn't just lost their money. They had lost everything. The fallout happened in stages. Dad's first instinct was denial. He spent the next 30 minutes calling his lawyer, his accountant, anyone who might tell him this was some bureaucratic mistake that money could fix. Then came bargaining. He slammed his phone down, his voice desperate. Harper, you don't understand what you've done. The medical practice, my reputation, everything I've built. Everything you built on fraud, I replied. You mean the practice that's been laundering money through fake deductions? The reputation built on stolen credentials? That everything? Mom flinched. Blake went pale. And then, finally, the anger. The moment Dad realized this wasn't something he could buy his way out of, that no amount of pleading or manipulation would make the federal charges disappear. And I was the one holding all the evidence. The conversation turned frantic. We can make a deal, Mom said, reaching across the table, her voice taking on that honey-sweet tone she used when she wanted something. Maybe if you tell them it was a misunderstanding? A family dispute? I pulled back before she could touch me. No. She blinked in confusion. No? I shook my head slowly, my voice unwavering. You don't get to negotiate with federal tax evasion. Not anymore. Blake's voice cracked with disbelief. Christ, Harper, it's just money. Can't you see you're destroying the family? I turned to him, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly, not the golden son, not some Wall Street genius I had spent years envying, just another entitled man who had never faced real consequences. A man who had built his success on other people's money. A man who, for the first time, was learning that actions have consequences. I stood up slowly, gathering my purse. Enjoy explaining this to your clients at the investment bank. Mom stepped forward desperately. Harper, wait. I walked toward the door. Dad's voice followed me, sharp with fury. If you walk out that door, you're dead to this family. I paused at the threshold, turning back one last time. I was never alive to this family to begin with. And with that, I stepped into the crisp autumn air, the cold biting against my face as I pulled the door closed behind me. I didn't look back. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking toward justice. That night, I sat in my apartment, curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, watching the city lights twinkle through my window. My phone buzzed with blocked numbers, voicemails I would never listen to, text messages I would never read. The apartment was quiet, orderly, mine. I exhaled slowly, letting years of suppressed anger finally lift from my shoulders, feeling something I had never experienced before. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but something deeper, integrity. I wasn't interested in their apologies. I wasn't interested in reconciliation. I had simply done what any ethical accountant would do when faced with evidence of fraud. And for the first time in my life, I was completely free. My apartment was peaceful, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, regardless of cost. I sat by my desk, my CPA certificate hanging above it, finally displayed with the pride it deserved. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone. And yet I had never felt more connected to who I was meant to be. The silence wasn't empty. It didn't carry the weight of their expectations or the sting of their dismissal. It was just honest. For so long I had convinced myself that what I needed was recognition, some grand moment when they would finally see my worth. But sitting here in my own space, surrounded by the career I had built through merit, I realized their recognition had never been the point. There was no closure because there was nothing to close. They had shown me exactly who they were for 28 years. And I had finally chosen myself over them. Tomorrow I would go back to work, help honest people navigate complex tax codes, build a practice based on competence instead of connections. Because this was never about revenge. This was about professional ethics. And I had upheld them. The fallout was swift and merciless. A week passed before Mom called. I didn't answer. The voicemails accumulated, each one more frantic than the last. Harper, your dad's practice is in jeopardy. I don't understand why you're destroying us. Each message was laced with something she had perfected, the ability to reframe criminal behavior as family betrayal. She wasn't calling because she felt remorse. She was calling because, for the first time, I had done something they couldn't control. Then Blake called. His voice was razor-sharp, stripped of Wall Street charm. You really think this makes you righteous? Fine. Destroy Dad's practice. But don't expect us to welcome you back when you realize how empty your vindication feels. I smiled and deleted the message. Because that was what he would never grasp. I wasn't seeking vindication. I was living with integrity. 3 months passed, then 6. I didn't reach out. They couldn't either, not while under federal investigation. The calls stopped. The only news came through professional networks, colleagues who mentioned the scandal in hushed tones. They were imploding. Dad's practice had been shuttered. The IRS had seized their home. Blake's firm had terminated his employment. And me? I was building something real. I spent my days at my accounting practice, helping honest small business owners navigate tax compliance, turning my expertise into something that served people instead of enabling fraud. I found purpose in every clean audit, every legitimate deduction, every client who trusted me to handle their finances with integrity. I wasn't lonely. I wasn't vindictive. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement that would never come. Because the truth was, I had already succeeded. Not because I had exposed their crimes, but because I had finally built a life based on my own values. And that was worth more than any family approval. Because this wasn't just about justice. It was about professional integrity. And for the first time in my life, I was the one living it. I never saw them again and years passed. The occasional email would find its way into my inbox, impersonal, carefully worded, hope your practice is going well, followed by passive-aggressive hints like, we'd love to hear how you're doing. I never replied. Blake moved to a smaller firm in another state. Mom still told people she had 2 children, though I suspect in private she only acknowledged one. Dad never forgave me. And I never needed him to. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about them. It was about me. And the career I had built on integrity, away from their corruption, away from their manipulation, away from the suffocating expectations they had imposed on me my entire life. My practice was mine. My reputation was mine. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly who I was meant to be. The city hummed outside my office windows, the skyline glittering with honest ambition. I adjusted my reading glasses, reviewing the final tax return of the day, the satisfaction of clean numbers and legitimate deductions filling me with quiet pride. This was home now. Not because of the office space or the client list, but because I had built it through my own merit. And as I sat there, looking out at the bustling street below, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe before. I had never needed their approval. Not then, not now, not ever. And that was the most liberating truth of all. There are moments in life when we find ourselves standing at a crossroads, forced to choose between enabling corruption and upholding our principles. This story is not just about family dysfunction or financial fraud. It is about something much deeper, the realization of professional integrity, the courage to report wrongdoing, and the undeniable power that comes with finally choosing ethics over family loyalty. The lessons embedded in this journey are universal, applicable to anyone who has ever discovered that those closest to them were compromising their values. One of the most profound lessons in this story is that we do not have to protect people who exploit us. For years, Harper lived in the shadow of her family's golden boy, watching as her professional expertise was dismissed while her credentials were secretly stolen. She was conditioned to believe that family loyalty meant silence, that her role was to support Blake's success while her own achievements went unrecognized. But when you grow up in an environment where success is worshipped and methods are ignored, you learn to quiet that ethical voice, convincing yourself that maybe family should come before rules. But the truth is, you are not obligated to compromise your integrity to protect others' crimes. Harper's decision to report the fraud was not driven by vengeance, but by professional duty, the realization that she had both the power and the obligation to stop the criminal behavior. This leads to the second powerful lesson: sometimes doing what's right requires devastating those we love. But real integrity often demands choosing between personal relationships and professional obligations. Harper never wanted to destroy her family. She never sought to ruin their lives. Instead, she followed the evidence. She consulted her training. She reported the crimes. And when the consequences came, she accepted them with the understanding that true integrity doesn't come from protecting wrongdoers, but from ensuring justice regardless of personal cost. She did not destroy them out of spite. She simply refused to be complicit in their crimes. She simply followed the legal requirements of her profession, forcing them to face the consequences of their own choices. Another vital lesson is that criminals will always try to reframe accountability as betrayal. The moment the family faced consequences, they did not reflect on their crimes. They did not acknowledge their years of fraud, their identity theft, their professional misconduct. Instead, they played the victim. How could you destroy your own family? Why would you choose strangers over us? This is a predictable reaction from those who have committed crimes without consequence. They are not upset because they were wronged. They are upset because they are finally being held accountable. When people have benefited from your silence about their crimes, they will always frame your honesty as betrayal. But you are not responsible for their comfort with accountability. This is where another fundamental truth emerges: you do not owe criminals your complicity, even when they're family. When Harper walked out of that house, she did not apologize for reporting fraud. She did not defend her choice to follow professional ethics. Because understanding was never required. They knew their actions were illegal because they had hidden them. The moment you stop protecting people from the consequences of their crimes, you reclaim your integrity. Professional integrity is often framed as cold or heartless. Society teaches us that family loyalty trumps everything, that blood is thicker than law, that we must protect our loved ones no matter what they've done. But what happens when family becomes a criminal enterprise? The answer is clear: you follow your training. You report the crimes. You protect the integrity of your profession. You stop waiting for them to become honest. You stop waiting for them to respect your expertise. Because at the end of the day, your professional integrity is not negotiable, and you do not need anyone's permission to uphold it. Some people will never stop committing crimes. Some people will never respect professional standards. But compliance with ethics is not something that is granted to you by family approval. It is something you maintain for yourself, on your own terms, according to your professional obligations. This brings us to perhaps the most liberating truth of all: you do not need permission to do what's right. For so long, Harper's career had been defined by accommodation. Accommodating their dismissal of her expertise. Accommodating their exploitation of her credentials. But the most important lesson she learned was that some people will never stop committing crimes voluntarily. And that is not your failing. It is simply because they chose crime over integrity. And when you finally accept that, when you finally stop trying to reform criminals, you fulfill your professional obligations. Because professional integrity is something you uphold for yourself, according to your training, regardless of personal cost. Harper didn't need them to approve of her reporting their crimes. She didn't need them to understand why fraud is wrong. She just needed to fulfill them herself. And once she did, once she finally stopped accommodating criminal behavior, once she finally upheld her professional standards, she succeeded. She maintained her integrity. And that was worth more than any family approval.